The night my husband told the ER nurse she'll be fine, she's tough, and walked out to catch his fantasy football draft. I was coding on the table. I didn't find out he'd said that until 3 weeks later, when a nurse named Patricia pulled me aside before I was discharged and told me quietly, like she was confessing something that had been weighing on her. She said she'd seen a lot of things in 15 years of emergency nursing, but she'd never seen someone's husband leave during a code and come back the next morning with a coffee like nothing had happened. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I was not a woman who saw herself as a victim. I was not someone who complained. I had been the person in my family who handled things, who stayed calm, who made the phone calls, who showed up. I thought that was a personality trait. It took me until I was 31 years old, lying in a hospital bed with tubes in my arm, to understand it was a role I had been assigned before I was old enough to consent to it. Let me back up. I grew up in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. My parents had 2 kids, my older brother Daniel and me. Daniel was 4 years older, and from the time I was aware of anything, I was aware that Daniel was the one who mattered more. Not in a cruel, obvious way. My parents weren't monsters. They were just people who had quietly decided, without ever saying it out loud, that Daniel's future was the investment and mine was the given. Daniel played baseball. My dad drove 2 hours each way to his travel league games every weekend from the time Daniel was 9 until he graduated high school. I did gymnastics for 3 years, and my mom came to maybe 4 meets. When I asked why she missed the state qualifier, I came in second, my best finish ever. She said she'd had a headache. That was the explanation. A headache. I stopped doing gymnastics after that. Not because I wanted to, because I understood, somewhere in the way kids understand things without having the words for it, that no one was going to show up for me the way they showed up for him. And I didn't want to keep finding that out over and over again. I was 12 when I got my first job, not because we needed the money. My dad worked in insurance, we were solidly middle class. But I wanted things. New shoes, a better backpack, the kind of jeans the other girls wore. My parents weren't buying those things for me the way they bought them for Daniel without being asked, so I figured out early that if I wanted something, I had to earn it myself. By 15, I was waitressing at a diner on Friday and Saturday nights, lying about my age, making $60 or $70 in tips on a good night. By the time I was 17, I had nearly $4,000 saved in a bank account. I'd opened myself with my mom's signature when I was 16. I was proud of that money. I was proud of myself. Then I got into Ohio State. My parents sat me down 2 weeks after my acceptance letter arrived. My dad had a spreadsheet printed out. He talked about family finances like he was presenting to a board. The short version was this. They had a college savings account that had been accumulating since I was born. There was money in it for me. But rather than me accessing it directly, they thought it made more sense for everything to flow through a shared family account. My savings, their contribution, Daniel's leftover money from his own college fund, which he hadn't fully used. They said it was simpler. Tax reasons, just how families handle these things. I didn't know enough to question it. I was 17. My dad had a spreadsheet. I signed the paperwork they put in front of me and went back to being excited about college. I moved into the dorms in August. I kept working. Campus jobs, waitressing on weekends. I kept depositing money into the shared family account because that was the system. Every month, 150, 200, sometimes more. I was putting myself through school, or so I believed. My parents said they were managing the account and everything was being tracked. I trusted them because they were my parents, and that is what you do when you are 17 and then 18 and then 20, and you have never been given a specific reason not to. I graduated in 4 years with a degree in elementary education. I got a job teaching 3rd grade at a school in Dublin, Ohio. I was 22, making $38,000 a year, feeling genuinely good about my life. I met my husband Marcus at a friend's birthday party that fall. He was funny and confident and paid attention to me in a way that felt intoxicating after a childhood of not being paid attention to. We dated for 2 years. He proposed on a Tuesday night in my apartment with a ring he'd picked out himself, and I said yes before he finished the sentence. We got married when I was 25. Small wedding, my parents' backyard, about 60 people. Daniel gave a toast that was mostly about himself. My mum cried. My dad shook Marcus's hand and said, "Take care of her." I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say, like I was being transferred. The first year of marriage was good. The second year was harder. Marcus worked in sales and traveled a lot, and when he came home, he was tired in a way that made him distant and a little irritable. I told myself that was normal, that all marriages had seasons. The third year, I started getting headaches that wouldn't go away. By headaches, I mean crushing pain behind my right eye, nausea, sensitivity to light so severe that I had to leave my classroom 3 times in 1 month. My doctor ran some tests and referred me to a neurologist who ordered an MRI, who found what she described to me in a very calm, measured voice as a small arteriovenous malformation. A tangle of abnormal blood vessels in my brain that had apparently been there my whole life and had recently decided to become a problem. She told me it wasn't necessarily an emergency. It needed to be monitored. There were treatment options. She wanted to see me back in 6 weeks. I drove home from that appointment and sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. When I told Marcus, he nodded and asked what was for dinner. I told my parents the next day on the phone. My mum said, "Oh, honey." My dad said the doctors were probably being overly cautious. Daniel texted me a week later and said he'd read about it online and it sounded like not a big deal. I went back to the neurologist. I started treatment, medication first, then a referral to a specialist in Cleveland. I drove to Cleveland alone because Marcus had a work trip and my parents had something. I can't remember what. Isn't that funny? I can't remember what was more important than driving their daughter to a specialist for a brain condition, but there was something. My Aunt Carol drove me. My dad's sister, who lived 40 minutes away and had always been quietly kind to me in the way that some relatives are kind to the child they can see is getting the short end of things. She drove me to Cleveland and bought me lunch and sat in the waiting room for 3 hours and didn't make me feel like a burden even once. 8 months into treatment on a Thursday night in October, I collapsed in my bathroom. I remember the floor tile being cold. I remember thinking I should call someone. I remember not being able to get up. Marcus found me when he got home from work. He called 911. I was unconscious by the time the ambulance got there. The AVM had ruptured. A small bleed, the doctors would tell me later. But enough. Enough to make my brain do things that required immediate intervention. Enough that when I arrived at the ER, things moved very quickly and then I flatlined twice on the table. I don't remember any of that. I know it happened because nurses told me, because there are medical records, because Patricia eventually told me what she saw. What I know is that Marcus called my parents from the hospital. He called them while I was in surgery, while it was genuinely unclear whether I would survive the night. My parents live 45 minutes away from that hospital. 45 minutes. They didn't come. My dad told Marcus they'd come in the morning, that it was late, that there was nothing they could do anyway. He said, and Marcus told me this months later, like it was a mild inconvenience he'd forgotten to mention. Let us know if anything changes. Let us know if anything changes. I survived the night. I survived the surgery. I spent 11 days in the ICU and another week in a regular room, and through all of it, my parents came to see me twice. Twice in 18 days, both times for less than an hour. Both times my mum talked about how hard it was for her to see me like that. My dad brought me a crossword puzzle book and told me it would help with cognition. Marcus was there more than they were, I'll give him that. But Marcus was also the one who, as I later found out, left during the most critical night to go home and sleep because he had a work call at 8 in the morning. The nurse who told me about his comment, "She'll be fine, she's tough," said it with such careful neutrality that I understood she was telling me something important, something she thought I deserved to know. I was discharged in November. I went home. I did outpatient physical therapy. I had a lot of time to think. Somewhere in those quiet weeks of recovery, something shifted in me. I'm not sure I can explain it exactly. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was more like clarity. Like a fog had lifted and I was seeing the shape of my life very plainly for maybe the first time. I started going through paperwork. I don't know why I started there. Maybe because I was a person who handled things, and handling things meant knowing where you stood financially. My husband and I had separate accounts for personal spending and a joint account for household expenses, but I had never really audited my own financial picture since we got married. I pulled everything up. My accounts, the old statements I'd kept in a folder in my desk, the paperwork from years ago. And then I found the family account documentation from when I was 17. I sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours going through it. The account my parents had set up, the one that was supposed to be holding my college savings, my contributions, the education money that was mine, had been drawn down to almost nothing by the time I graduated college, not by tuition payments. I cross-referenced everything I could. My student loans had covered tuition. The money I'd deposited over 4 years, plus whatever had been in my college fund, should have been there. It wasn't. I called my bank and requested complete transaction histories going back 10 years. It took a week to get them. When I did, I sat down with a yellow legal pad and I started adding things up. My contributions alone from age 17 to 22 totaled just over $22,000. There was additional money in the account when I started college. My parents had confirmed that, had used it as the reason I needed to be part of the shared system. Based on what they told me when I was 17, there should have been somewhere between $35,000 and $40,000 in that account by the time I graduated. What was actually there when the account was closed? When my parents closed it 6 months after my graduation, without telling me, was $1,100. The money had been withdrawn in increments, small enough to not trigger automatic flags, regular enough to look like a pattern. Over 4 years while I was at college depositing my waitressing money in campus job checks because I thought I was building my future, someone had been steadily emptying the account. I need to stop here and tell you about my grandmother. My mom's mother, Grandma Ruth, who lived in a little house in Dayton and made the best biscuits I've ever had and used to call me her serious girl. Because I always wanted to know how things worked. I adored her. She was the adult in my childhood who made me feel like I made sense. When I was about 14, she and my mum had some kind of falling out. I was never told what it was about. Suddenly, visits to Grandma Ruth stopped. My mum would say she was busy or that Grandma Ruth was difficult, or just changed the subject. I wrote my grandmother letters for a while, actual letters, because that's how she preferred to communicate, and she stopped writing back. I assume she decided she didn't want contact. I was a teenager. I was hurt. I eventually stopped trying. I hadn't spoken to Grandma Ruth in over 15 years. While I was recovering, still going through my financial papers, I found something in a box of my old childhood things my mum had dropped off years ago. A rubber-banded bundle of envelopes. My name on every one, in my grandmother's careful handwriting. Postmarked over a span of 12 years. Unopened. My mother had kept my grandmother's letters. All of them. For over a decade. She had intercepted them before I ever saw them and kept them in a box and eventually passed that box along to me, probably forgetting what was in it, probably never imagining I would look carefully. And I was sitting in my living room in November, recovering from brain surgery, opening letters my grandmother had written me when I was 15, 17, 19, 20, 25. She had written me every year on my birthday. She had asked about school. She had told me about her garden, her church friends, a trip she took to Gatlinburg. She had said she didn't understand why I'd stopped writing back, but that she loved me and hoped I was well. The last letter was dated 3 years earlier. She said she was getting older, and her health wasn't great, and she thought about me often. She said she had updated her will and that she hoped someday we'd find our way back to each other. I sat on my living room floor and I sobbed in a way I don't think I'd ever sobbed in my adult life. Not even in the hospital. Not even when I was scared. I cried for the 15 years I'd lost with my grandmother because my mother had decided, for whatever reason, jealousy, control, I still don't fully understand it, that our relationship needed to be severed. I cried for my grandmother writing to me year after year and thinking I didn't care enough to respond. I cried for my 17-year-old self dropping her waitressing checks into an account that was being emptied. I called my Aunt Carol the next morning. I didn't tell her everything at first. I asked her if she knew how Grandma Ruth was doing. There was a pause. "Honey," she said, "Ruth passed away 8 months ago. 8 months ago, 3 months before my brain bleed, my grandmother had died thinking I had abandoned her, and I had been completely unaware she was even gone." I asked my aunt if she knew anything about a will. Another pause, longer this time. "I actually wanted to talk to you about that," she said. "Ruth left you something." Your mom told us you didn't want to be contacted. We didn't push because it wasn't our place, I guess. But I'm glad you called. My grandmother had left me her house, a paid-off three-bedroom in Dayton worth about $220,000 and $70,000 in a savings account. She had left my mother nothing. The will had been updated 2 years before she died. Whatever my grandmother had known or suspected, she had made her feelings clear in the only way available to her. My mother had known about the will. My mother had told my grandmother's estate attorney that I was unreachable, uninterested, that there were family complications. The attorney, to his credit, had not simply closed the estate, he had been trying to find a way to contact me properly. My aunt stepping in when I called her is what finally untangled it. I'm going to skip over some of the middle part because it's long and it was ugly and it involved lawyers and conversations I am not ready to recount fully. What I will tell you is this. I retained an attorney. We sent a demand letter to my parents regarding the education account. My father initially denied everything, and then when we threatened to file a civil suit, and my attorney laid out exactly what the bank records showed, he stopped denying it. We also had my grandmother's estate reopened, with proper documentation of my identity and my right to inherit. My mother had not legally stolen from the estate, she had not forged anything. But she had materially misrepresented my wishes to delay or prevent me from inheriting. Her own share under the will was zero, so her motivation was spite or grief or something I may never fully understand. My parents ultimately agreed to a repayment settlement to avoid a lawsuit, $31,000, which was a negotiated figure accounting for the money taken plus interest, minus what they claimed to have contributed to my college fund originally. Was it enough? My attorney thought it was a reasonable outcome given the difficulty of proving exact damages. I thought it was a fraction of what they owed me in ways that couldn't be quantified in a settlement agreement. But I took it, because I needed it to be over. I divorced Marcus 9 months after I came home from the hospital. The marriage had been struggling before the brain bleed, and what happened during it was not something I was able to set aside. A person who walks out of the emergency room during a cold and comes home the next day with a coffee has shown you something about who they are. I believed him. I used the settlement money as part of my financial restart, combined with my grandmother's inheritance, and I put a down payment on a small house in a suburb of Columbus. I know some people would say I handled the grandmother situation wrong too, that I should have pushed harder to stay in touch with her, that I could have found her address myself, tracked her down. Maybe. I was a teenager when the contact ended, and then I was a young adult who believed I had been rejected. I was also someone who had learned very early that reaching out and not being received was painful enough to stop doing. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying it was the behavior of someone who had been conditioned to believe that her needs would not be met. I am 32 now. I teach 3rd grade. I have a small house with a yard where I grow tomatoes badly, and a cat named Henderson who sleeps on my feet. My Aunt Carol comes for Sunday dinner sometimes. A few colleagues have become real friends, the kind who texted every day when I was in the hospital, the kind who brought food and didn't make me feel like a burden. I have not spoken to my parents since the settlement was finalized. I have not spoken to Daniel, who, when I told him what our parents had done, said he was sure there was another side to it and that I should try to see it from their perspective. I did not respond. There is no perspective from which emptying your daughter's college savings account for 5 years and then not showing up when she is dying is something I need to understand more charitably. There are days when it still catches me. Not often, but sometimes, when I'm doing something ordinary, making coffee, watching students line up for recess, and the thought comes through quiet and clear. Your parents chose your brother's baseball game over your survival. Your mother hid your grandmother's letters for 15 years. The people who were supposed to be your foundation weren't. But here's what I know. At 32, that I didn't know at 17 or 25. That is their failure, not mine. I did not cause it. I could not have prevented it. And it does not have to be the defining story of my life. I still have the letters, all of them, in a box on my bookshelf. The same box they came in, rubber band finally gone, each envelope carefully opened now. I read them sometimes. Grandma Ruth had good handwriting and a dry sense of humor, and she always remembered to ask about whatever I'd mentioned, caring about the last time she'd written. She was rooting for me the whole time. She just couldn't reach me. I'm reachable now. I've thought a lot about what made everything finally break open. It wasn't the brain bleed. It wasn't even Marcus leaving the ER that night. It was the quiet moment weeks later when I was sitting at my kitchen table going through papers. Something so ordinary, so small, and the whole shape of my life suddenly became visible to me at once. That's how it tends to work, I think. The truth doesn't usually arrive dramatically. It arrives when you finally have enough stillness to see what was always there. For a long time, I told myself that the people around me had made mistakes, that my parents played favorites out of habit, not intention, that Marcus was just distracted, just overwhelmed, just not great in crises, that none of it was deliberate. Giving people that kind of benefit of the doubt felt like generosity. I understand now it was something else. It was the instinct of someone who had learned very young that asking for more than you were given was not safe. So instead of asking, I explained. I minimized. I made things make sense in whatever way allowed me to keep going without confronting what was actually true. What was actually true is that the people who were supposed to be my foundation had treated me consistently and across decades as someone whose needs were secondary. That is not a mistake made once. That is a pattern. And patterns are choices, accumulated over time, that eventually become a person's character. The money my parents took wasn't just money. It was every Friday and Saturday night I spent waitressing instead of being 17. It was the version of myself who believed she was building something, being careful, doing the right thing, while someone quietly undid all of it from the other end. When I found that out, I didn't just grieve the money. I grieved the years, the effort, the faith, and Grandma Ruth's letters. Those hit differently than anything else, because my grandmother had not abandoned me. She had written to me every single year. She had remembered. She had been sitting in her house in Dayton thinking her serious girl had grown up and stopped caring, and I had been in Columbus thinking I had been rejected, and between us was my mother, who had made that distance on purpose and then lived with it for 15 years like it was nothing. I think about what it costs a person to do something like that, to intercept letters, to tell an old woman her granddaughter doesn't want contact, to hold a box of envelopes and decide over and over again not to pass them along. That is not an accident, that is a sustained choice, and the person who makes that choice is showing you plainly what they believe about love, that it is a resource to be managed, not a thing to be given freely. The hardest and most clarifying thing I have ever learned is this. You cannot reason someone into valuing you if they have already decided you are not worth the full cost of their attention. You can be patient, you can be understanding, you can reframe and excuse and explain, and none of it will change the fundamental calculation they have made about your worth. The only thing in your control is whether you keep participating in that arrangement. I stopped participating. Not in anger by the end. Anger burns out. What replaced it was something quieter. A kind of clear-headed recognition that I had one life, and I had already spent a significant portion of it organizing myself around people who would not have done the same for me. That was not a debt I was willing to keep paying. Aunt Carol drove me to Cleveland when no one else would. Patricia, a nurse who didn't know me, thought I deserved to know the truth. Grandma Ruth updated her will and left me everything she had, because she believed in me even when she thought I'd forgotten her. The people who showed up for me were not the ones I'd been taught to count on. That used to make me sad. Now it mostly makes me careful. Careful about who I let into my life. Careful about who I show up for. Careful about the difference between people who love you when it's convenient and people who love you when it costs something. Henderson is asleep on the couch next to me as I write this. The tomatoes are doing badly again. Sunday dinner with Aunt Carol is in 3 days, and I'm making the biscuit recipe I finally found. The one Grandma Ruth mentioned in her 2009 letter. The one with buttermilk and a little extra salt. I am leachable now. That is enough.